The Female Cyclist series, Menstrual Cycle and Endurance Exercise Performance. This is another multi-episode series, with this one dedicated exclusively to the female cyclist and by association to most endurance female athletes out there. And oh boy, or should I say oh girl, I've been wanting to bring this topic to the podcast. After years of disproportionate research focusing mostly on male athletes whilst applying those same results to both genders, we are finally entering in a very positive wave of trying to address this issue with more research performed with women. And here on Fuel the Pedal, we would really like to give our small contribution by having here two lovely ladies and researchers who are in the front lines of this battle to even the field. And for that, on this first episode of this series, we are joined by Kelly McNulty and Kirsty Elliott-Sale. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal podcast. And we are back. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal podcast, whether this is your first time here or if you've been following my ramblings from the very beginning. Thanks for tuning in, and as usual, I am your host again, Gabriel Martins, that Portuguese nutritionist broadcasting from Madrid, and yet again trying to bring you insightful interviews with researchers on issues related to exercise performance and endurance sports, in particular cycling. Once again, I must thank all of you who have been reaching out through email and social media regarding the previous episode series with Professor Louise Burke regarding the ketogenic diet and endurance sports. It has been great to have your feedback and knowing it was useful for your practice, and hopefully we were able to provide a balanced view over that topic. I hope to bring that topic back to the podcast someday. But today we are focusing our attention on the female athlete, particularly in trying to understand whether or not the different menstrual cycling phases impact on exercise performance, whether during hard training sessions or during competitions. And this is what Kelly McNulty and Kirsty Elliott-Sale set out to do, along with many other authors who have been contributing to the research on this topic. The result was a complex yet brilliant systematic review and meta-analysis published on Sports Medicine just a couple of months ago. You can find it on the show notes of this episode on fuelthepedal.com. Free download is available. So there are several reasons for bringing this topic here to the podcast, and one of them we have already mentioned, which is to give a small contribution to even the field, and by doing so perhaps increase the quality of research performed with women, but also try to address a small trend I begin to see before it gets even bigger, which is planning training sessions according to the menstrual cycling phase, as if all menstrual cycling phases alone produce the same effects and in the same frequency on every single woman. And there are apps on the market trying to tell you in which phase you should focus on strength training, for example, when to go easy, or in which phase you may be more likely to have injuries. And I just don't see the science to back this up. So similarly with what happens with many trends surrounding nutrition, exercise and physiology, business companies will of course notice these trends in advance and understandably take advantage if there's a market for it, regardless if the science is there or not. So there are indeed a range of suggested mechanisms by which the cyclical fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone across the menstrual cycle might affect performance, but as in other modern trends in nutrition and exercise physiology, we can pretty much find mechanisms to provide a theoretical basis for the point we want to expose, but the studies performed with human subjects need to prove those mechanisms, and that is exactly what we are focusing our attention on today. But before we embark in this first journey of our series, similarly to what happened with the episode with Professor Greg Haff on strength training for cyclists, this is beyond my reach as a nutritionist and a topic that I confess I haven't focused my attention on too much in the past. So it is to be expected that my questions and interview reflect these same limitations. But nevertheless, I'll try to do my best to make this as practical and useful to you as possible, and also to learn from it in the process. So if you have an interest in this topic, Kelly McNulty has this amazing social media profile called The Period of the Period, a very thought-provoking profile where she publishes images with quotes and short messages regarding this topic. And only after doing this interview, I found out that Period After Period is also a podcast. So make sure to follow her on your podcast platforms if you're interested in these topics. Kelly is definitely one to watch out for. And as for Kirsty Elliott-Sale, well, what can I say? She's not only a tremendous researcher in this area, but a force to be reckoned with, and it's just fantastic to feel her energy and passion talking about this topic, which makes it so stimulating to listen to her and just to easily visualize what she's telling us so eagerly. So I hope you enjoyed this episode 35, the Female Cyclist series, Menstrual Cycle and Endurance Exercise Performance. Are we ready to modulate exercise across the menstrual cycle? With Kelly McNulty and Kirsty Elliott-Sale up next. Wait for it on Fuel the Pedal podcast. Here comes the guitar. And so today with us for this very special episode, we have Kelly McNulty. How are you, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you, and super excited to be here alongside Kirsty.
Well, that makes two of us. Super excited to talk to you. And Kirsty, we are finally doing this. Welcome to the show, Kirsty.
Good morning, Gabriel. Thank you so much for the invitation. Like Kelly, I'm super excited to take part and to finally be on your podcast.
Ladies, it is an absolute privilege to have you both on the podcast and have the opportunity to talk exclusively about this topic and start contributing to disseminate the research around the female athlete and perhaps motivate more quality research. I would really love to keep the podcast alive so we can repeat and update this topic on another episode in a couple of years with a much clearer understanding of the female athlete's physiology, how the different menstrual cycle phases could affect performance, and basically have more data to stop extrapolating effects derived from studies performed with male participants. And God, I'm already talking too much. How rude of me. I believe some presentations are in order. So Kelly, would you do the honors and present yourself to the listeners and tell us a bit about the work you've been doing and even your favorite dish if you want to?
I'm glad to be going first because I totally wouldn't know how to follow up after Kirsty. But I'm a PhD student at Northumbria University, and my main interests are in this area of the female athlete and investigating the effects of the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraceptive use on the likes of performance, adaptation and recovery. A little bit more about my background. I completed my undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science and then a master's in strength and conditioning. And these were both at Northumbria, so they can't get rid of me just yet. To be totally honest, a PhD wasn't really one of my goals I had during my master's. I don't come from an academic background at all. And I didn't really understand the full ins and outs of a PhD until I was riding that roller coaster. But I think I was extremely lucky that Kirsty Hicks, so my supervisor, came to me and she was like, there's a PhD here. I think you'd be a great fit if you wanted to apply. And I made that sound much easier than what it was, but obviously it was a big decision at the time. I was mainly working in golf, strength and conditioning. That's kind of my background. But being a female athlete, I've always kind of been aware of my menstrual cycle and hormonal contraceptive use and how that could potentially be affecting my performance and training. But for me, it was never ever talked about, which kind of blows my mind a little bit now. But I think recently it's kind of gained a lot of interest. So I'm not sure if it's totally correct or if I'm the only one whose Twitter feed's full of menstrual cycles. But there does seem to be an increased want and need for this type of research, or a drive to make periods and contraceptives the normal thing that they are, really, which is great to see that we're finally sort of running with that. But my journey in this area is totally very new, but I feel grateful to have already had the experiences that I've had, especially getting to work alongside and learning from the likes of Kirsty and some of the best in this area.
Well, I can surely relate to your story of not aiming to go for a PhD, but ending up on that boat nonetheless. So, your turn, Kirsty. How would you present yourself to the world?
Gosh, I'm not sure I can follow Kelly. She's far too modest, actually. Kelly's really one to watch. She very much is a rising star in this area, and actually it's my privilege to be one of her supervisors alongside the other Kirsty. Just to confuse things, Kelly studied her sort of main supervisor is called Kirsty Hicks. So there's a couple of Kirstys working here alongside Kelly. So I'm a bit of a dinosaur in comparison to Kelly. I've been in this field for just over 20 years. So I started my PhD back in the late 90s when music was good. And I did my degree and my PhD at Liverpool John Moores. It was a privilege to study there amongst some really, great names. Had some really great supervisors as well. Tom Riley was one of my supervisors. So obviously I've been really fortunate to have a really strong pedigree behind me. And yes, I did my PhD looking at female reproductive hormones and how they affect muscle strength. And, the topic just really grabbed me. And a bit like Kelly, I used to be a female athlete myself. So a lifetime ago, I was a kickboxer. Hard to imagine now. But yeah, so, the club that I trained in was an all-male club. I was the only female. We certainly never spoke about menstrual cycles or, even considered hormonal contraceptive use. So my experience in terms of sport, that just wasn't mentioned. I trained like a guy, and that's okay. That's not a problem. But I think we could do better, and I think that we could do some quite specific female, information, training, nutrition, and so on. So I'm really great to see it. I'm really happy to see a change in the tide. So got hooked into this topic 20 years ago, and I've stayed in the field ever since, and I've been chipping away. And I completely agree with Kelly that there's a real increased appetite. And as I say, I think we can do better. We've had a really good start. Sports science is a big field. I can understand why we started off researching on males, because they were, obviously they participated more. And as I say, that's absolutely fine. But I think now is a really great time to give attention, much needed attention, to female athletes as participation begins to grow, and such that, as I said, we can give more specific guidelines if we need to around training, nutrition and performance. So that's where we are. Fast forward 20 years and here we are having a podcast with you.
Well, even though we fast forward, I'm sure you still got the moves of kickboxing, so I'll be sure to keep this a peaceful conversation with you, Kirsty. Kelly, I didn't understand. You still practice? What was your, or still is your sport?
I played golf. That's my background. Yeah, golfer.
Golf and kickboxing. What a graceful combination.
Yeah.
What a great mix. And it's with this mix of ingredients that we are going to start cooking our episode today. And as I said on the intro before, this episode came to be thanks to a recent meta-analysis and systematic review published in Sports Medicine, which Kelly and Kirsty authored. And I must say that this interview was very challenging for me to prepare. We can easily see that this article is a handful and the analysis is a bit complex, but we really needed to summarize the research so far on this topic and especially point out the limitations and the low quality of the studies performed so far. And this is something that we will hopefully get into in our talk today with more detail. And Alex Hutchinson did a brilliant piece about this while trying to summarize your article and answer the question if the menstrual cycle phase could affect performance, and I quote, "After an exhaustive search of the literature, researchers conclude that, well, it's complicated." And I think this sums it up pretty well, and Kelly and Kirsty will tell us exactly how and why is it complicated. So in the last decade, women's road cycling gained more and more attention from the sponsors and the UCI itself. And this new attention had a clear positive effect on women's cycling. In 2012, only 28 professional cycling teams with 350 female cyclists were registered in the UCI, while in 2020, 52 teams started the season with 630 female cyclists. This means a growth of 85% in teams and 80% in female cyclists. And for those hearing this podcast by the end of September 2020, the UCI World Championships have just finished and we've witnessed Anna van der Breggen claiming double gold on the TT and road race events. A tremendous athlete like other incredible women in cycling such as Elisa Longo Borghini, Lizzie Dynan, Annemiek van Vleuten, Keija Nuvodoma, Chloe Dygert, who suffered an unfortunate crash during the TT and to whom I wish a speedy recovery. These are currently the athletes dominating the road cycling setting, and this increased rise in participation of female athletes in this and many other sports requires the knowledge and science to go with. Still, most studies on cycling physiology and overall performance have been mostly focused on the male athlete, with limited research available describing the physiology and the factors underpinning performance for women's professional events, in particular the female cyclists. As brilliantly put by the authors we are interviewing today, performance-based research in women has not kept pace with the exponential rise in participation. For that reason, on this episode we will have Kelly and Kirsty explain the effects that the different phases of the menstrual cycle may exert on the physical performance of female athletes, and for that we'll go through some important basic physiological considerations regarding the menstrual cycle and the normal hormone fluctuations. And at the end of this episode we'll try to answer the question, are we ready to design specific guidelines on how to modulate exercise and training according to the menstrual cycle? So I will start with the obvious yet important question for the lead author of this paper. Kelly, what has motivated you and the rest of the authors to join forces to sum up the current knowledge in this systematic review, and what gaps did you feel that needed to be filled?
I think to answer this question, we should go back a little while in time. So if we take the 1928 Amsterdam Olympics, so 6 women collapsed after the 800-metre race, and the IOC banned women from running any distance greater than 200 metres. And this was because they believed that longer distance would too great a call on feminine strength, and that's their words, not mine. But if we fast forward to today, we have women athletes achieving incredible feats, all the way from Bridget Koske, I can never pronounce her name, so hopefully I got that right, and the likes of Sophie Power. So she's a British ultra runner who competed the UTM just 3 months postpartum. And I think it's incredible performances like these that remind us, or continue to remind us, that women can perform beyond original limits. And alongside these more elite achievements, there's been an increase in the number of women participating in sport and exercise more recreationally. And so as women continue to pursue that sort of peak performance or better performance, whether that's at that elite level or even a recreational level, I think it's important that we start to think differently about what it's going to take to allow us to achieve that full potential, because it might not always be the same that's worked in men. And I think a useful way to think about this is if we think about sort of Team Sky. Now, I'm not a cyclist expert by any means, so don't shoot me on my facts, but the sports scientist in me loves and still loves their sort of marginal gains project, which had the aim of winning the Tour de France within 5 years. And in order to do this, they delved into all of the science that they could possibly get their hands on. So, for instance, they redesigned the bike seats, made them more comfortable, asked the riders to wear those heated shorts to maintain ideal muscle temperature, tested various clothing in wind tunnels. They determined the type of pillow and mattress to best have a nice sleep, really, for each individual rider. And then there was stuff about painting the inside of the team truck white, everything like that, to spot dust, which could degrade the performance of a bike. And I think all of these changes gave Team Sky this marginal gain. For example, one of those things alone wouldn't have made a difference to overall performance, but when you start to piece them together, they can add up and have that sort of significant effect. And as we all know, by 2012, Team Sky were flying, and Wiggins made the impossible dream of the Tour de France come true. And I think that was in the squad's 3rd season. So getting back on track, and if we think, what if the riders of the Tour de France had been women? What additional women-specific factors might we needed to have considered? And then there's things such as the menstrual cycle, hormonal contraceptives, and then breast support, pelvic floor, pregnancy. The list can go on and on. But at the moment in sport, women athletes usually train in a similar way to male counterparts, like what Kirsty said, their support that's applied to their performance, whether that's nutrition, physiology, psychology, etc., is usually based on what's been done on men or what's been successful in male athletes. And very little research, in fact, examines the determinants of sports performance and the effectiveness of the likes of training interventions for women specifically. For instance, out of all of the papers in the top 3 sports science journals, There's a study that shows only 4% of the research was done exclusively on women. And so although research into these women-specific performance started way back in 1876, surprisingly, we still know very little about the direction or the magnitude of the effects of the menstrual cycle on performance. And alongside this lack of research is sort of the poor quality of the existing research, which further then limits our ability to draw these evidence-based conclusions on what might be best for women athletes. And then that means there are potentially lots of areas where we're not looking into to optimize training and performance. We're just not considering them for women. But more specific to our research question, there are a range of suggested mechanisms by which the menstrual cycle might have an effect on performance. But to date, the research in this area is highly conflicting. So some studies report on improved performance in the early follicular phase, ovulatory phase, whereas some have shown no effect at all. And therefore, a consensus was yet to be reached. And therefore, we set out to determine the effects of the menstrual cycle on exercise performance and provide these evidence-based or practical performance recommendations to women. Sorry, that was such a long-winded answer.
Not at all. Wow, Kelly. Well, first of all, Kirsty, you are absolutely right. Kelly is one to watch out for. Thank you for this brilliant introduction and rationale, throwing in the cycling examples and to the pot. And you've raised some really important points, some of which we're going to try and answer along this episode. But following on what you said regarding the complexity of the study so far, I'll once again mention Alex Hutchinson. It's complicated, and it's important to have this in mind because in science, we're often searching for the yes or no and the black or white approaches or answers to our questions. And so, Kirsty, I will direct the next question to you. As someone who's been publishing extensively in this area, how do you see the current state of research and knowledge in this area?
It's a great question. And I think actually, I don't want to follow Kelly. I think Kelly should do the whole interview. Okay, so I am going to answer this in the same depth and grace as Kelly answered. So I think that, this topic isn't new. So I think at the moment there's a big appetite, but it's not a new topic. I just want to, shout out to the researchers who have, been working in this field, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, because they exist and they're great. And I thank them for their contribution so far. But the research has been sporadic. It seems to come in waves. In popularity. So, in the late 90s when I first started, there were some really great seminal papers then, and then it seemed to go off the boil and then a few more dripped in, but now there's this, huge bang. And, I think without sounding negative, because I'm super pleased that everybody is now focused on the female athlete, because it has been at times a lonely journey. And so I'm super pleased that we're all interested. But I guess what I would caution is that because we really want to contribute to female athletes now, we have a big desire, a big appetite. We still have to take our time and we still have to focus on the quality of our research. Because in our rush to get answers, in our rush to fill the gap, to bridge the space, we mustn't just, push out a lot of, poor research. So, we really have to concentrate on quality and quantity. So I'm really pleased to see, new researchers, if we have an army of Kellys, that would be fantastic. And you'll see this whole area change really quickly. But I guess being the dinosaur I am, I'm just sort of cautioning people to say this type of research, when we really start to talk about, how to conduct research on menstrual cycle phase or hormonal contraceptive use, it takes a little bit of time. The research design, I wouldn't say it's complicated, but it's time consuming. And to do it well, you need time, you need money. It's a lot of repeated measures. So as I say, I think, really keeping our eye on increasing the quantity of information, but watching the quality. And I think, that's where we're at now. Really big appetite, lots of new energetic researchers coming into the field, which is great. And as I say, I'll just maybe, come full circle back to what Kelly said and a little bit about what I said in the introduction. We're not here saying that you have to repeat every study that was ever, done in sports science on males. You don't necessarily have to repeat everything on females. A lot of the sort of fundamental training principles, nutrition principles will be the same for both sexes. But it's exactly how Kelly described it. In order to get, some of these marginal gains, in order for female athletes to fulfill their full potential, then if we consider menstrual cycle phase or hormonal contraceptive use, that could be the little bit. When you add all of those little bits together, that could be the bit that gets the gold medal or the fastest time trial or the yellow jersey. So, I think we want to really come across today as being pragmatic, that we're not starting from scratch. This is not necessarily a new topic. Let's, use what we know from male athletes, but make those really specific tweaks based on, ovarian steroid hormones for our females so they can fulfill their full potential.
What shall I do with you? Would you both stop giving incredible answers? Kirsty, you've touched on something that it's not only true for female athlete-specific research, but to so many other areas. And for those of us who are in academia publishing research, we are all familiar with this urge to publish or perish type of mentality. And now that this topic is trendy and scientific journals are interested in publishing it, it may lead to researchers to just rush their publications. And instead of having a growth in high quality research, we would just have a growth in number of studies with female athletes in general, which is definitely not what we're looking for to change the current scenario. So I really wanted to touch on another important consideration before moving forward, and this I think is a massive issue that needs to be addressed, which is the openness to talk about this topic in the communication between coach and athlete. And there is a recently published study looking exactly at this by Natalie Brown from Swansea University, where the authors highlight that athletes indicated an openness to talk about the menstrual cycle to other females. However, there was a variation in the comfort athletes experienced regarding talking to male coaches. Kelly, would you agree that this is an important issue to address?
Yeah, I definitely think that's such a massive point and a massive part of it, that we need to basically remove that sort of stigma surrounding periods. And then once that happens, you can have those impactful and insightful discussions. I don't think, from my personal experience, but I am a woman, that no athlete is ever sort of not being comfortable in chatting about them. I think if you get them on the topic, they could talk for ages about it. But I think as being more of a male coach, I think it might be not something that you're not comfortable with chatting because you don't have the education behind it as much. And I think you don't really know where to start a conversation like that kind of thing. And I think in order to do that, just read as much about it as a topic as you can and educate yourself. And you might have to go all the way back to that basic physiology, and that's totally fine. You'll be surprised by how many women also need to actually do this and how many of us don't know what on earth's going on in our own bodies. I think there's a great paper by Claire Minahan on the similar topic that highlighted only 6% of athletes in their study can correctly identify both estrogen and progesterone as the women's sex hormones that fluctuate across the menstrual cycle, which in itself is a real eye-opener. And I think you might find it difficult or uncomfortable the first time you mention that word or get athletes to chat about it, but it soon becomes the normal thing that it is. Whether you might just incorporate into a sort of a menstrual health questionnaire, into a few other little questionnaires that you already do. You talk about already nutrition, sleep, everything in between. So I think it's important that we just put periods into that conversation as well. I think once you open up the conversation, more athletes will feel more comfortable and sort of that stigma is removed from the topic.
Mm-hmm. No doubt, and let's hope that your answer to this question contributes to make this a more normal conversation among athletes and coaches as a way of increasing communication, and by having this feedback allowing coaches to better adapt particular training sessions to the athlete's effort perception. So one aspect that is, of course, the pillar of our talk today is the menstrual cycle, the hormonal fluctuations which happen primarily to support reproduction, but as brilliantly highlighted in your introduction, it can also have diverse effects on multiple physiological systems, including cardiovascular, respiratory, metabolic, and neuromuscular parameters, which can ultimately influence exercise performance. But before we get into that, perhaps it would be important for the listeners and for myself as well to go back in time a bit, back to the biology class, and have you explain for us the menstrual cycle and the hormonal fluctuations that derive from it. So, Kirsty, would you do the honors?
Okay, so this is such a visual question. So podcast listeners, you can imagine me sat now in my kitchen waving my arms around. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to use my words to try and describe this diagram for you. So you need to imagine, if you can, this sort of 28-day sort of axis along the bottom, okay? And it goes from day 1 to 28, and this is what we call an idealized menstrual cycle. So if you were to open a textbook, it would describe a menstrual cycle as being 28 days. And this is based on some research done about 60 years ago, and 28 days was the average that they found, and then this became the sort of textbook number. Just to say up front that it is idealized. I call it a unicorn cycle because they're quite rare. So don't worry if your athlete doesn't have a 28-day cycle. In order to have a normal menstrual cycle, that can be anywhere between 21 and 35 days. So quite, upfront, we can see there's a lot of variation in cycle length. And that could be that, and here I'm going to get myself really tongue-tied between cycles and cyclists. So if you have a cyclist that you're working with, a female cyclist, one might have a menstrual cycle that lasts 25 days, and the next cyclist might have a cycle that lasts sort of 31 days, but they're both considered to be normal. Okay, so that's the first thing. But for the purpose of this sort of talk, just to standardize it, we're going to use this 28-day sort of time frame. So as I say, imagine if you're looking at a graph along the bottom, our days numbered 1 to 28, so moving across time. The first hormone I'm going to describe to you is estrogen. So as Kelly mentioned, estrogen and progesterone are the two sort of main female ovarian steroid hormones that we're going to talk about. So at the start of the cycle, so on day 1, estrogen levels are low. So how do you know what's day 1? So day 1 is the first day of the period, okay? And as you'll see, I'm super comfortable using the word period and bleeding and menstruation. It's no bother to me, and I encourage all of you to have the same freedom. Honestly, it's fine. Nothing bad will happen. Say period. It's great. Okay, so day 1 is the first day of the period, and that's hopefully, if you have an honest and sort of very transparent relationship with your cyclist, they will be comfortable in telling you, today I got my period. And at this point, you know that estrogen levels are low. Okay, so as we start to move across time, this estrogen level starts to rise. So around day 5, you'll see that instead of sort of being a flat line, it starts to increase rapidly. And between sort of days 5 and about 10 or 11, that's when there's a really sharp increase. Okay, I really am moving my fingers and hands, and you can't see it. It's so funny. Okay, so around day 11 or 12, you get this real sort of peak in estrogen. So it's an inverted U, and I never understand why people say an inverted U and they just don't say an N. But listeners, it's a flat line to start with, and then it goes into a peak, into an N, and then it begins to drop off sharply around day 13, 14, 15. It's still dropping, and then it begins to rise again, and it has a secondary peak around days 20 to 23 before it drops off again down to day 28, and then it's low to start that next cycle. Okay, so if I were to be very concise, which I never am being Irish, I'm going to describe it in one short sentence. Estrogen is low at the start when the athlete has their period. It then has a peak almost towards the middle of the cycle. It then drops off, and it has a secondary peak in the latter third of the cycle. So it's low, high, medium, and then low again. Okay, so that's the best I can describe it using my words. So at the same time, progesterone also has a pattern across the menstrual cycle. So again, day 1, the day the athlete gets their period, progesterone levels are low. Okay, and it stays low really throughout the whole first half of the cycle, and it only really begins to rise around day sort of 16, 17, and then it has its biggest peak around sort of days 20 to 23 before dropping off again. So really progesterone is low sort of for the first half, and then it has a peak in the second half. And, if we were to try and, I guess, match them up so that you get the sort of equivalent ratios, I would say that estrogen and progesterone are low at the start. In the middle, estrogen is high and progesterone is low. And then in that latter third, progesterone is high, and estrogen is high, or you could call that medium, just because the reason why I'm sort of saying maybe medium is because it's not quite as high as its first peak. And that hopefully gives you a very quick biology lesson, and hopefully you can sort of in your mind visualize how that is. But if not, you can check out a really nice figure in the meta-analysis, which will bring that to life.
Well, I'm sure the listeners have quite the mental image in their heads, imagining you waving your arms in your kitchen. But I would agree that it helps a lot to have the image representing the menstrual cycle phases around you during the explanation, and I'll make sure to include it in the show notes for this episode. And now that we have a general overview on the topic, we know that estrogen and progesterone increase and decrease in a somewhat predictable pattern throughout a 28-day menstrual cycle, whose duration may vary a lot, as Kirsty emphasized, and estrogen peaking around day 10 during the late follicular phase, then dropping down during ovulation around days 13, 14, increasing again this time alongside with progesterone around days 19 and 20, both dropping down around day 23 and 24 in the late luteal phase. I hope I got that right. So with this in mind, what would be the mechanisms by which these hormone fluctuations could affect, or at least provide a theoretical basis to influence training outcomes in an endurance athlete and ultimately influence performance when competing? Kelly?
Yeah, so as Kirsty said, the menstrual cycle has this primary function of support and reproduction. But researchers also highlighted that these fluctuations in the concentrations of estrogen and progesterone across an ovulatory menstrual cycle, so as Kirsty's just explained, might also exert some complex effects on other physiological systems, such as the cardiovascular, respiratory, metabolic, neuromuscular, etc. So if we were to solely focus on the factors that might be more important or might affect endurance performance a little more, for instance, one of the most recognized changes across the menstrual cycle is this change in variation in body temperature. So at the onset of menstruation, so your period, basal body temperature is at its lowest and stays relatively low until following ovulation, and then it remains high throughout the rest of the luteal phase. And that's a result of the thermogenic effects of progesterone. So theoretically, this could make women more likely to develop a heat illness during this latter phase of the menstrual cycle, which could have subsequent effects for exercise performance, in particular, prolonged endurance events, especially performance in the heat. Additionally, estrogen and progesterone have been reported to play a role in regulating the likes of substrate metabolism. So research highlights that estrogen promotes muscle glycogen synthesis activity, which stimulates glycogen uptake and storage in the liver and muscle. In particular, during exercise, estrogen spares glycogen stores and moves metabolism more towards the free fatty acids, whereas progesterone has been suggested to oppose this effect. So given this, women might be at a theoretical metabolic advantage during the ovulatory and mid-luteal phases of the menstrual cycle when you've got that higher estrogen. And then you've got loads of additional factors. So the influence of these hormones on strength. So estrogen is thought to have an anabolic effect on skeletal muscle, whereas progesterone is thought to have more of an opposing effect. You've got the neuromuscular, so estrogen is known to have an excitatory effect on the central nervous system via its actions on the neurotransmitter receptors. And then you've got recovery, so estrogen is thought to have a protective function against the likes of muscle damage. So there might be a point in the cycle when recovery is quicker, such as the late follicular or the ovulatory phases. And then there's so many other things such as sleep. So progesterone can influence sleep, and therefore you might sleep better during the mid-luteal phase. And then there's psychology. So estrogen is described as this feel-good hormone. So you might get a cyclist that's more motivated, confident, and energized when estrogen's at the high concentrations. So I think if we factor all of these into consideration and think about how all of these separate factors could determine performance, it's then possible that performance might vary across the menstrual cycle because of the fluctuations in these hormones. But as I mentioned previously, the data and the studies from this are highly conflicting, hence the need for this review. But I think it's also important, as Kirsty's highlighted, to remember that it's going to affect some athletes some athletes will be highly affected by their menstrual cycle, whereas others will be entirely unaffected, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, and I wonder if, alongside with all these impacts you've mentioned, if there's also an influence on more psychological parameters such as motivation to train or to perform in different menstrual cycle phases. Kirsty?
Yeah, I think we need to really sort of almost look at the menstrual cycle in two different ways. I think certainly the work that Kelly and I have been involved with previously, and this meta-analysis is sort of based on if we change one of the hormone concentrations, what sort of physiological cascade effect does it have, and then ultimately how does it affect performance. But I think the other sort of strand that we need to consider is exactly around what you've asked in your question. Okay, if you change these hormone concentrations, how does that change the athlete's perception on, fatigue or effort or motivation? And, that's certainly, I'll be really honest, I've not done work in that particular way, but I'm really starting to turn my attention to it because actually, if an athlete feels differently in a particular phase and doesn't feel motivated to train or feels more fatigued or any of those things, then that's probably going to have a bigger impact than maybe some of the physiological changes that we've previously been looking at, the direct sort of hormone to physiology sort of effect. And, it's great. I think, I'm certainly not the only one to be thinking in this way. I know lots of people are turning their attention there. I think the best I can do as a physiologist is try to make friends with somebody who knows, so another researcher and scientist who knows more about this than I do, and try to sort of include some of these measures now. So instead of just saying to my athlete, okay, you're in this particular phase of your cycle, I want you to do a time trial so I can see how performance is affected. I think we need to start saying, okay, we're going to do this time trial on the bike, but actually I want to ask you before you start, how do you feel today? Do you feel affected? If it's your period, do you have any side effects of that, any cramps or headaches? Or, if you're in that sort of really late luteal phase just before you get your period, do you have any symptoms of premenstrual syndrome or that sort of thing? Because I think before we've made it very black and white, very much hormone to physiology, but actually I think we need to include a lot of these other sort of factors, because I think the perception and our feelings and our motivation and our fatigue, that's going to have really quite a big impact. And so and maybe I'm skipping ahead here to a different question, but when we get to talking about having athletes track their menstrual cycle, I would say that whilst you're tracking these sort of performance metrics, you should also be tracking your sort of feelings, and probably not giving that the best term, but by feelings I mean all of the things like I feel great today, I feel motivated today, I feel sad today, I feel angry, whatever it is. I'm probably not using the best phrasing here, but hopefully the listeners get what I mean. I think we really have to look at that sort of sense of well-being and health on top of the performance metrics. So I think what we do is build up a really comprehensive picture of, is the phase and the hormonal changes affecting me as an individual, my thoughts and feelings, as well as what's going on internally that I can't see.
That, I think, it would be the true personalized approach that you highlight in your study, already making here a bit of a spoiler alert, but the athlete's effort perception still remains as one of the most powerful indicators to consider, given the fact that all these responses according to the menstrual cycle can vary immensely, as both of you have been vigorously emphasizing. So this meta-analysis really is the first of its kind in this particular topic, and it surely looks like a handful. So while this sort of technical questions might not be appealing to the listeners, I think it's essential here to have you explain the criteria used to perform this meta-analysis. So just in case anyone believes this type of research is easy to perform and meta-analysis just appear out of thin air, could you go through the population, inclusion criteria, exercise outcomes, and other aspects that you feel like highlighting for the listeners? Kirsty.
Right. So you're absolutely right. These are, this is not an easy thing to do. And here I really do have to give Kelly credit because, she really is she's the machine here. I mean that as a compliment. Maybe that didn't come out quite right. But I mean, Kelly really put her head down and worked super hard. And there is a process to follow with a meta-analysis. But just to give the listeners, a brief sense of the type of approach we take. So Kelly and the team looked at 4 different databases, and that's plugging in a lot of different search terms to try and find the literature. So the searching is somewhat difficult. And just to give you a sense of, how many papers are appearing there. So for one database alone, you might find, nearly 2,000 papers that appear to be relevant and that you then have to sift through. And I think all in, Kelly retrieved more than almost 5,000 papers. And clearly there are not 5,000 papers on this topic, or we would, of course, not be telling you that there is a little quantity. So that just goes to show you that actually plugging in quite specific search terms actually gives you back a lot of irrelevant papers. So you get a lot of papers. Then some of these appear to be duplicates because you're searching using the same terms but in different places. So you obviously get rid of your duplications, and that gets you down. So that got us down from about 5,000. We're now down around the sort of 2,000, 1,500 mark. And then you really have to sort of get in, as you say, Gabriel, with the criteria and assess which of these articles are really sort of relevant to your research question, the topic that you want to sort of investigate. And so this is quite a long process, as you can imagine. We're able to look and screen via title and abstract first in the first instance, so that will clear many more papers out of your pot. And then you get down to what we call sort of the final batch of articles, and again there are still more in there than you might expect, and you have to retrieve the full paper and read the full paper and see about its relevancy. So that obviously takes quite a long time. And just to remind you of those numbers, I think Kelly went from finding almost 5,000 papers to including around 78 in this meta-analysis. So the search and selection process is quite lengthy. And as I say, we've got a lot of criteria that helps guide us as to what goes in and what goes out. So apologies if you're an author who has written a paper on this topic and it wasn't included here. It'll just be because obviously we have quite a specific research question in mind, and you have to be, very focused on the papers that will really help you answer that question. And then, of course, 78 papers, as I said, went into this meta-analysis, and that's data from just over 1,000 participants went into this review. And if you think we're done then, we're clearly not. We have a fantastic statistician as a part of our team, Paul Swinton. He's just amazing. And as a physiologist, I'm so in awe of his statistical knowledge. And so, he looks at our data, he helps us to interpret that data. He runs some very fantastic stats. Please don't ask me, Gabriel, to explain the stats. He does his magic, his statistical magic.
I won't.
And we sit down and we interpret that. And if you think that's the job done, actually it's not, because on top of, analysing the data itself to look at the numbers and the outcomes, we then obviously take this, quality approach too. And so we also look at each of those 78 included studies. We looked at the quality of the work. So we use what we call a down and black checklist. We modified that slightly. And I think we had around 15 pieces of criteria as part of that checklist. So again, each of those full 78 papers were assessed against the 15 pieces of criteria. And then after that, we also had another set of criteria that we marked it again. So I guess in a very long way, I'm trying to explain to you, it's quite a long process. You don't sort of do a meta-analysis like this overnight. We'll be super honest, it took us almost a year, and that was, pretty consistently working on that. And after we submitted to SportsMed, we had fantastic reviewers look at our papers to peer review it, and they came back. And because of the time it took to write the review, submit the review, and have it reviewed by the blind reviewing process, they actually asked us, which was really fair comment, so the last time that you searched for these papers was 12 months ago. Could you update the search? And so we went back and we looked at the intervening time and we put back in. So there were some papers published in that intervening year, and they went in And we did all the quality again, and we, so what you're reading this year is really the most up to date. But as you said, it isn't an easy thing. It's very worthwhile though, and really, as I say, I must start and end my little narrative by saying well done to Kelly, because obviously Kelly, as the lead author and the PhD student on this project, really did the lion's share of this work. So, fantastic job, Kelly. Well done.
Congratulations, Kelly, indeed. And I have questions regarding the different menstrual cycle phases, and I'll get to those later because I think the results here are as interesting for what you didn't find as for what you did. So considering all the analysis you've performed, and this might be a tough question, Kelly, so bear with me here, please. What results have you obtained? And most importantly, for athletes and coaches who read this research and try to interpret these results, what limitations and word of advice would you give when trying to translate these findings into practice? Kelly.
So where to start really with this question? I guess ultimately our paper demonstrated that exercise performance might be trivially reduced during this early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. So when estrogen and progesterone concentrations are at their lowest compared with all the other menstrual cycle phases. And from a practical perspective, as the effects tended to be so small and variable between all of the studies, the implications of what we could actually say were so small for meaningless for the most of us. However, these small effects might have some more relevance to elite athletes, so where the difference in winning and losing is marginal, which is why we recommended that an individualized approach should be taken, whereby practitioners working with the elite sportswomen need to track and consider the menstrual cycle and be aware of the particular points in the cycle where exercise performance might be reduced or enhanced. And it's these individual experiences of the menstrual cycle, which should inform how we might adjust the training and performance to maximize the outcomes. I think what's also important is what Kirsty was mentioning about the quality, is that the quality of evidence from the 78 studies included in this review were primarily classified as low, so which meant based on the grade approach that we took, the confidence in our evidence in our meta-analysis was also low and should therefore be interpreted with caution. So I think what particularly stood out for me during this quality process was that 71% of the studies were initially allocated this quality rating of moderate. However, following the questions pertaining to menstrual cycle phase identification and verification, so using ovulation and hormonal bloods analysis, only 24% of these studies left were moderate. So that's quite a jump from 71 to 40. So very few studies were using these combination of methods that are recommended. So there's a great paper by Jans de Jong. I know I've totally pronounced her name wrong and made a fool of myself. I can never get it right. But she proposes that you use this calendar-based counting method in conjunction with urinary ovulation detection kits, and then subsequently verify menstrual cycle phase with serum estrogen and progesterone. And I think it's important that given the rationale for exploring the menstrual cycle is these changes in hormones, that we need to accurately verify that we are measuring that menstrual cycle phase that we intend to, so that we can make accurate conclusions and between study comparisons can be made. So I think as well as what we saw that exercise performance might be trivially reduced, it's important to then say where we got the evidence from. And at the minute, there just wasn't sort of them high quality studies. I think what was great to see was both reviews were then followed by the BASIS expert statement, so by both Kirsty's and then Emma Ross and Rich Burden, and that outlines the good practice to follow when conducting and implementing the female athlete-based research. It's a great paper. And I think collectively then what we tried to, as well as performing these guidelines if we could, was to hopefully then give people guidelines on like producing this research, which will hopefully reduce some of the poor practice. However, I think we need to get comfortable with this individualized approach, given that every woman's cycle is different and changes across her lifespan. As Kirsty puts it in this BASIS expert statement, there's probably never going to be this universal blueprint that coaches and practitioners can use. And it's important to remember that the menstrual cycle is just one performance consideration. It's not the only performance consideration. Like we've touched on, there's so many other performance considerations in general on top of this, not just women-specific things like REDS, breast health, pelvic floor, etc. There's all of the other performance things that come on top. And I guess ultimately the big thing is for coaches and practitioners to create a space where athletes feel comfortable to talk about these topics. And then, like we said, mentioned previously, start monitoring your athletes' responses across their cycle and developing your own athlete profiles. And from this, you'll notice that some women might be affected and not affected. And then jump into the literature and read as much as what you can, but then also remember to be critical of it. So what we saw was low quality predominantly. So make sure you see where the inconsistencies are, what methods they used, and then maybe use this good stuff or the good stuff that you find to make those reasonable adjustments until there is enough high quality evidence from the science which can be used to inform the practice. As Kirsty mentioned, though, I think the majority of sport and exercise science data will benefit everyone. So I think she puts it nicely as not throwing the baby out the bathwater. Don't forget the basic science, but there could be something there for some athlete.
The menstrual cycle is one performance consideration, not the only performance consideration. And another important thing that you mentioned there, along with this previous quote, that could be perfectly the summary of this episode: starting to monitor your athlete's response across the cycle and create your own athlete profile. That, I think, sums up pretty well what you've highlighted in your meta-analysis. And I should have perhaps included this question before, and I'll direct this one to you, Kirsty. I can only imagine how difficult it must have been to standardize comparisons between the different cycle phases. So for the listeners to understand, and again, for myself as well, how have you done this, and why did you use the early follicular phase as a reference?
That's a great question. So it is difficult to standardize. When you're comparing different papers by different groups of authors, we've never had an official consensus where we've all agreed that this particular period of time or this number of days is equal to this particular phase, and we don't have agreement on a certain hormonal profile that we can attribute to a particular phase. And so really what you find is that authors label phases either where they read it somewhere else or how they were sort of trained at university, and so you have all this sort of disagreement on terms. So I might say early follicular is days 1 to 4, and the next paper you read might say the early follicular phase is days 2 to 6. So these sort of inconsistencies exist because we don't have an absolute sort of hard and fast rule. I don't think we can get a hard and fast rule because of that variability in cycle length that I mentioned earlier on. So, for example, my mid-luteal phase could be day 22, but the athlete next to me, her mid-luteal phase might not occur till day 30. And so therefore, putting names on phases is very difficult. So let me just quickly tell you what we did. So I'm currently looking at our huge spreadsheet that we used, where we put in all of the data from all of these papers that we included. And in one column, we recorded how the authors had described their phases. So, for example, they might have described the phase as menses, and then in brackets we put, day 3 of period, and then in the column next to that we have our phase classification. So what we had to do really, and hopefully I'm describing sufficiently well, is that we recorded what they called it and how they sort of described it using a day and numbering system, and then we tried to make it sort of fit or align with the classifications and phases that we wanted to report. So we broke it down into the early follicular phase being days 1 to 5, late follicular phase being days 6 to 12, ovulation being days 13 to 15, early luteal phase being days 16 to 19, mid-luteal phase being 20 to 23, and the late luteal phase being days 24 to 28. So you can see that, we have a large number of phases there because we wanted to try and capture and incorporate as much data as we could from previous publications. And by doing that, obviously, as I say, we were able to take the data through from the majority of users. So what I just want to, I guess, finish with that point is, we really sliced the menstrual cycle into a lot of phases to facilitate using as much data as we could from the previous papers so that we didn't lose anybody's, time points. And then in our meta-analysis, we have a figure which shows you I guess, the popularity of the phases. So what I mean by that is, if you get a chance to look at the paper, in figure 5, you see what we call a network diagram. And here are the phases that I've just mentioned: early follicular, late follicular, ovulation, early, mid, and late luteal. And basically, if you look at this diagram, the bigger the circle, that represents, the more studies that use that particular time point. So just to bring this alive for you, because I know you can't see it, in our diagram, the early follicular, mid luteal, and late follicular are the most common cited in papers. Ovulation and late luteal are next, I guess, in terms of popularity, and the early luteal was hardly ever mentioned. So as I say, that was the approach we took in terms of standardizing for this particular paper. And then just to quickly answer, I guess, the part B of your question around why did we sort of compare everything back to the early follicular. And we did this because it's one of those really popular time points that, appears in the majority of research. So we knew we'd have a lot of data captured in the early follicular phase. And B, it just, I guess, makes good common sense that researchers are using this phase a lot, because as I mentioned, the early follicular phase, it has a very obvious I guess, physiological cue. So the early follicular phase is days 1 to 5, and that's when the athlete has their period. And so therefore, it's difficult to really pinpoint other phases that don't have any obvious cues. But of course, it's very obvious when your athlete has their period. So we rely as researchers on our athletes phoning us up and saying, oh, I got my period today. And then we get them in the lab quickly and we do whatever sort of test that we want to on them over that sort of days 2, 3 and 4. And so that's why the majority of research is in there. And actually, it's just because it's the most obvious phase, because it's the one that's used most often, and because actually it's quite stable. Estrogen and progesterone are low for 5 consecutive days. It just makes a really nice, I guess, baseline, so that when they start to change, and as we know from my previous answer, they don't change in the same pattern. It just made sense that was a nice sort of consistent phase where they were both low, to then obviously make comparisons where they were, having different peaks and troughs. It made sense to compare it against that particular sort of, baseline for want of a word. So I hope that answers your question, Gabriel.
Well, it sure does, and it makes absolute sense. You've used the early follicular phase as a control phase to then make these comparisons, and I hope this was left clear for the listeners as well. In addition to this, I'm really curious to know if you've performed any subgroup analysis, say, for example, looking specifically at strength and endurance performance outcomes according to the different menstrual cycle phases. Kelly?
When we set out originally, we had planned, if the data allowed us, to be able to do a set of these sub-analyses, like you said, so mainly separating performance into strength and endurance, and then further subcategories based on this, so endurance into continuous, intermittent, and strength into the likes of max and rate of force production, and then even further again. So that big table that Kirsty was looking at, we set it, we numbered everything and had that all ready to go. But like Kirsty said, ultimately the whole analysis is down to the whiz that is Paul Swinton. So I'm probably doing it nowhere near enough justice as it deserves. But the reason why we pooled strength and endurance outcomes all together in our study was that no evidence was obtained that indicated a different effect between these performance categories, which meant ultimately we couldn't dive deeper into these sub-analyses that we'd coded for, if I'm making sense. Basically, we found that the response was the same, in that exercise performance might be trivially reduced during the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle compared to all the other phases, whether that be for endurance or strength. So I think I've seen a couple of comments saying that the paper doesn't differentiate between strength and endurance and whacks them all in together. And I think it's important to highlight that we all as authors didn't think that performance for strength and endurance is the same and underpinned by these determinants. Because of this, the effects of estrogen and progesterone might be different. All of the backgrounds enabled us to realize this, and that's why we did differentiate between strength and endurance, and all of that was catered for in our stats by Paul. It was just that we pulled them together because there was no evidence of that different effect, if I'm making any sense.
Oh, yes, you are making a lot of sense. And it's also important for listeners to understand how difficult it is to perform this sort of research. And there are just so many parameters and sub-analysis that are really difficult to perform on top of all the challenges you've faced to carry on this analysis. And so I ask you the question that I believe we have been already answering throughout this episode, but nonetheless, the question that we've set out to answer. Is it still early or not to prescribe or design training plans for endurance athletes such as cyclists according to the menstrual cycle, looking at the quantity and the quality of the research available so far? Kirsty?
Yes, I think it's too early to really have sort of global recommendations for female endurance athletes. I think we need to, really look at the quality of the evidence. We need to be critical. And so I think in order to be led by the research, we just have to wait. We have to have patience and we have to wait. On the flip side, though, that sounds quite sort of negative, that, we have no answers right now. But actually, on the flip side, we can push forward our practice. And this is what this sort of dual stream that we have. It's great to have research evidence-based to underpin our practice, but while we're waiting for that, why not build our own evidence base? So what I mean by this, and I think I'm repeating what Kelly said a little bit, but I'll be really brief. What I mean by this is work on an individual basis, track your athlete's menstrual cycle, and then see if there's any patterns. Can you notice any patterns yourself, based on their data? Some athletes won't be affected at all. Don't worry about it. Just do what you were doing anyway. If you are affected, then make small changes in order, to minimize any side effects or maximize any gains. And, we can do that. We can do that right now. We can give you advice on how to track your menstrual cycle. And we can push forward on an individual sort of level. And I think everything is positive. Generate your own data. Hopefully we're going to have a huge new wave of really high quality research. We all know what we're doing now. So we're, going to have this evidence to hopefully complement what we're doing in practice. But as I say, we just need to be patient, look for the good research, but at the same time, drive forward at an individual level, creating like bespoke programs based on our own data, because right now it's too early to put out, global guidelines. It's too early. And I'm well known for being quite outspoken about this. I disagree that we're in a place to do that right now, certainly based on the evidence that I've seen.
I couldn't agree more, and I direct a similar question to you, Kelly, by asking you what practical advice would you give female endurance athletes and coaches to sort of sum up everything we've been saying so far?
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more with Kirsty in that the evidence base isn't there. But for now, we can start to make our own guidelines from the evidence that we collect from our own individual athletes. And I think, as I touched on previously, I guess the big thing we need is for athletes, coaches, practitioners to all be able to talk comfortably and confidently about this. And then, because we need to open up the conversation so that when we do have a little bit more of a consensus in the literature, which there likely might never be because we're all so different, and we can use the guidance effectively. For instance, we don't want to have all this great science and then not be able to talk about it because periods are still seen as something that you shouldn't talk about. So that would be ridiculous. And I think, we need to just start, like as Kirsty says, tracking the menstrual cycles. And to do this, you can note down a few symptoms, emotions, behaviours, as well as the performance, like Kirsty mentioned. And it can be done very simply with a pen and paper. And you can use an app. But I think one thing with the apps is that the information it gives you about how you might feel or perform related on what part of your cycle you're in is often very generic. And so it can be frustrating for athletes or even sort of induce sort of anxiety if you're not conforming to what your app's telling you. You should be feeling. An athlete might be totally fine on a period, no symptoms, and not feel like it affects her performance. But the app might be shouting at her that she should be in bed with a hot water bottle, for instance, and that's not ideal. So everyone is individual, and I think this variability seems sort of like underappreciated or just sort of brushed to the side in this menstrual cycle and performance area. But then, like Kirsty says, we need that research behind, of high quality research that basically overall, if we consider women specific factors, we could have a great gain in performance. But again, like I mentioned, the majority, and like Kirsty said, the majority of sport and exercise data will benefit everyone. But this sort of women's specific research allows us to get that edge, that marginal gain. But ultimately, I think there's still so much to learn in this area, which can be seen as extremely exciting, whilst at the same time being incredibly frustrating. I don't know if I've got anything else to add to that. Kirsty did a good job.
Let's say it's just, inspirational to hear you both talking about this and complimenting each other's already great points on this, and how we should really track the menstrual cycle on a daily basis with pen and paper instead of fancy apps that can sort of paint a scenario that it's supposed to happen, but every woman will inevitably have different responses that can't just be predicted like that, but rather through monitoring and create an athlete's profile that you mentioned that is going to be different from your team member when comparing to the same menstrual cycle phase. And I think that is a tremendous final message. And in case we want to update this topic in 5 or 10 years, Kirsty, what research would you like to see performed?
Yeah, for me, I just would really like to see high quality studies. As I mentioned before, they're time consuming. They take some consideration. I think, I welcome any new researcher into this area. Brilliant. Please come in, join the gang. But I will, just caution that take the time you need to really understand hormonal profiles, because once you understand a eumenoric menstrual cycle or any of its irregularities, which we haven't even touched on today, that will really help you to design really great studies. So as I say, it takes time to embed yourself in this area. It takes time to design good studies. You have to do a lot of repeated measures to make sure that you're seeing something that's real, true, and consistent. It's expensive to study women because, really, like Kelly mentioned before, we need really to verify a menstrual cycle phase with a blood sample. So that's not cheap. This all sounds, please don't be put off. Whilst it sounds like I'm saying, it takes a long time and you need to be knowledgeable and it's expensive. Oh man, it's really rewarding research, and people want to hear from you if you're in this area. People want this knowledge. You'll be welcomed, if you're talking, sensibly about these sort of things at conferences, to athletes, to teams and so on. So I would say, welcome aboard. It's difficult, but what's wrong with difficult? Difficult is not bad. And the research that you can generate here will be so meaningful and so impactful. The appetite is there. Let's raise the number of our female athletes who are participating, so whether that's recreational or at the elite level. Let's, increase the number of women winning medals at the Olympics. Let's go for it. Everything here is positive. So whilst I'm saying, it can be time consuming, it can be expensive, it can be, a little bit difficult. That's not a bad thing. Welcome aboard. Let's get some really great high quality research out over the next decade, which really can underpin our practice. But let's not neglect, evidence coming from practice, and let's not neglect some of that sort of perception and feelings and behavior and emotion stuff that we talked about as well. Let's not just stick in one lane. Let's get all 3 lanes running simultaneously so that we benefit each other. Sorry, that was a super long answer. I got really into it.
We gotta love your enthusiasm, Kirsty. This is incredible. I love it. And we can surely count on Kelly to keep on making some serious, solid contributions to this field. Can you reveal what you have planned for what's left of your PhD research, Kelly?
I guess me personally, the next steps with my PhD are to now go on to look at sort of the recovery and adaptation side and how this all might be influenced by menstrual cycle and or contraceptive use with more experimental studies. So it was great to get into the labs a little bit more instead of with the review. It was a lot more sort of just at the desk. but we're utilising all those gold standard methods that we've highlighted in the review. And we made quite a great start to this study, but obviously, unfortunately, with everything that's happened, the testing's kind of come to a stop. But hopefully we can get back into the lab soon. And I'm looking forward to making a little bit more of a contribution in this area, like Kirsty said.
Looking forward to it, Kelly, and I can assure you that I'll be keeping an eye on your work. And if people want to keep up with your social media interactions, where can people go to?
I'm on Twitter, just Kelly McNulty. I've also kind of set up a little thing with female athletes and discussing sort of exercise performance, and that's on Twitter as well. It's the period of the period, so discussing research. It's still very new, but yeah, it's there if people would like to follow that as well.
That is indeed a great project, and I recommend you all to check out The Period of the Period, soon to be a wonderful podcast and topics related to what we've talked today. I'm sure of it. And how about you, Kirsty?
So if you want to, you can follow me on Twitter, and I'm at Elliott-Sale. There's no hyphen, and I'm a little bit greedy that my Elliott has 2 L's and 2 T's. So you might have to persevere to find me a little bit. But yeah, I'm on Twitter, and my feed is predominantly, as you might expect, around sort of obviously female physiology research and so on.
For all the listeners trying to memorize and going back to try and get the Twitter handle correctly, it's much easier to click on the Twitter link of each guest I insert on the show notes for this episode. And ladies, this has been a fantastic journey. I know I've learned a lot from the great points you made and the practical applications of how we should look at this topic, and hopefully listeners feel the same way and more high quality research is produced in the years to come. So ladies, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have enjoyed being on Feel the Pedal.
Thank you. I had a great time.
It was lovely to meet you. Thank you.
Et voilà. The first part of this series dedicated to the female athlete is concluded. I truly hope you've enjoyed this talk with these 2 wonderful ladies and took many important notes regarding this topic. As I told you before, there will be more on this topic, and on the following episode we're going to be focusing on the effects of oral contraceptives in female exercise performance to see if there are any interactions worth considering. Thank you again for choosing Feel the Pedal to keep you company, and I hope to have you here again for the continuation of this series. Take care, guys. This is Gabriel Martins, over and out.